I've done this a lot of different ways in my life. This is going to be the one that works the best. I've just tried to shake them into a box. The problem is half the time they just fly back to the limb. In fact, I'd say more than half the time. Probably a lot higher than half the time. Well, hello everybody. I'm on some beekeeping forums and I have people emailing me about what's blooming in their place, and it was 2 degrees yesterday morning here, so there's nothing blooming here. Let's talk, it's a little early to be talking about swarm prevention, but it won't be too long. Let's see if I can get where I can easily advance this. So before you take a lot of notes, all my presentations are on my website. If you go to my website and go down the left-hand side to presentations, it'll take you to this URL here, which is a list of all of them, and you can click on them and all the PowerPoints are there. So if you don't get things written down or you miss something and you wish you could go back and look at it again, I often refer to studies, and there's often a link in here that you can go find that study. So feel free to go look at that. Briefly, I'd like to mention I have a bee camp here every May. If you go to, again, just go to bushfarms.com, go to bees, go down the left-hand side till you get to bee camp. It'll have the details and all of that. I like to call it my Tom Sawyer bee camp. I want you to my house, do all my work for me and pay me. But I think you'll have a good time and you'll probably learn a lot. Also, I have an apprentice program. If you know anyone who does to pay and wants to spend a bee season with me, it really helps me get a lot of my work done. Trying to free bees, have treatment-free queens to try and supply what people want, but I can't really keep up with it anymore. I'm getting too old. Anyway, if you know anybody who'd like to be an apprentice, there's more information about that there. So let's talk about swarming. I don't know how many of you have ever been in the middle of something like this, but even thinking about it sometimes makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, but being in the middle of it always does. It's this tornado of bees in the air, and there's a power and an electricity about it that's quite awesome. The only problem with this from a beekeeper's point of view is it means a bunch of your bees are about to leave. And unless you can catch them before they, hopefully they'll settle down on a limb somewhere, maybe you can catch them. We'll talk about that a little later, but generally you're much better off to try to prevent it. Because if you can prevent the swarm, your bees will be much more productive. This is a swarm on the outside of a hive. They haven't really made up their mind whether they're going to move in or not. I'll talk about that a little more as we go along here. So let's talk about how to tell if the bees are trying to swarm. While I've got this picture of swarm cells here, let's talk about how you can tell that these are swarm cells and not supersedure cells or not emergency cells. I think the first giveaway is that they're not all the same age. I don't know if you start at the bottom one in the middle, you can see that it's capped. If you move up to your right and up, you'll see that one's not capped at all. It's just barely started. If you go a little further up, you see another one that's even less far along. And then right above that, you have 2 of them that are capped. And then you have one that got squished when I opened it. And then if you go to the right and drop back down to the bottom, you have one again that's not capped yet. So these are all different ages. When they swarm, they start them different ages on purpose. The purpose is so that they can swarm and after swarm and after swarm. In other words, they don't want the first queen, they don't want all of them with a swarm, and then they can let another one out And actually, if more than one tries to get out, they'll trap them in there and seal up the edge of a little flap, except for a little space where they can feed the queen. So they'll keep the queen in there. So my point is, the way you can tell they're swarming is by looking at the cells and see the age of the cells. That's the most useful piece of information. Looks like my internet's acting up. I got disconnected and reconnected here, but I think I'm back now. So, so what are the causes of swarm? Generally, this happens when it's not prime swarm season. This is more likely like the middle of summer or late fall. If they get too crowded and there's nowhere to put nectar, then the brood nest starts getting clogged up with nectar. That kind of sets off the sequence of events. I consider that different than a reproductive swarm. We'll talk about that in a second. So honey or pollen is clogging up the brood nest. The queen has nowhere to lay. And then you have a bunch of unemployed nurse bees because she has nowhere to lay. The emerging bees don't have any brood to take care of. And so it sets off this sequence of events that causes swarming. Then there's a reproductive swarm. The reproductive swarm is a different motivation. The bees are trying to do what every species on the planet does, and that is to try to reproduce, to try and perpetuate the species. So this is really the goal of any successful hive in the spring. Basically, they actually were preparing for it last fall by putting away enough food that they could raise a lot of brood before there's really a flow going in the spring. So they put away a lot of pollen, they put away a lot of honey, and then come spring, actually, though, I don't know if you've ever opened a hive up in the winter. It's probably not good for the bees, but it is good for your education. If you open up a hive in January, there's a good chance they've got a little tiny patch of brood going. Usually they'll just raise that little patch and then they'll take a break. And then sometime in February, they'll raise another little patch and they'll take a break. And then in March, this is at least in my location, in March, they'll get serious about raising brood. And then they'll raise a big patch of brood. And by the time that one's done, then they're fully into build up for the spring. And there's nothing blooming yet here. Nothing blooms here usually till April. Might get some red maple, but that'll only be if the weather warms up. If it doesn't warm up, not only will there not be any blooms, but the bees won't be out. So really, they're preparing for the spring buildup, which is to prepare for the swarming last fall when they put away all this pollen that they were going to need to raise all that brood, and they put away all this honey that they're going to need to raise all that brood. This is another reason you need to keep an eye on your colonies right about now and early in the spring, because for every frame of brood they raise, they burn through a frame of pollen and a frame of honey. Now they can get through winter on very little honey up until they start raising brood. But as soon as they start raising brood, they're burning through it like crazy. So really, this reproductive swarm is a sequence that's tied more to the weather and the calendar than it is to this. There was too many bees. Now they also want, though, when they swarm, to know that they've got enough bees to maintain the old colony plus start a new colony. And so if they feel like they're not that strong, they probably won't swarm. So like splitting them in the spring will often stop them. You have to keep in mind, though, this is a pretty deep instinct to want to reproduce. And so it takes some serious moves sometimes to stop them, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're just not going to succeed at keeping them from swarming. It doesn't mean you're a bad beekeeper. It just means sometimes they've just made up their mind and they're determined to get it done. So let's talk about the sequence of events in a reproductive swarm. Now, some of this happens in an overcrowding swarm too. So let's just this is starting from last fall. They put away the stores and they start rearing brood. Then they start focusing on the buildup. This is another thing you need to learn as a beekeeper if you haven't already, is that the thing that the colony is focused on at any given moment isn't always the same. It changes. So early in the spring, they're focused on building up enough that they can swarm. That's really kind of their goal, is to build up so they can swarm. And so they're focusing all their energy, all their resources on raising brood. Now, the next step is, once the population starts to peak, they start backfilling the brood nest so that the queen has nowhere to lay. And that accomplishes several things. One of the things that happens is, since it's full of nectar, the emerging bees don't have bees. Normally, they'd be nurse bees. Normally, they'd find an open cell with brood in it and start feeding it. But now, since there's not hardly any open brood, they're unemployed. Now, that's not an accident, that's on purpose. They need a lot of unemployed bees that aren't needed by the colony so that they can leave and start a new colony. If they don't have an excess of bees for the amount of work that needs to be done in the colony, then they'll be in trouble. They'll be behind. They won't be able to keep up with what needs to be done. But because they're backfilling the brood nest and there's no brood to take care of at the moment, that frees up those bees to leave. So that's the first thing that happens. The next thing it does is, because the queen can't find anywhere to lay, she starts losing weight. Now, I know you have people who tell you that they stop feeding the queen and therefore she loses weight, but that's got the cause and effect reversed. The queen has nowhere to lay and therefore she doesn't ask for food. The bees don't have any choice. Any bee can ask any bee for food and they have to give it to them. That's the rule. So, and that includes the queen. So if the queen asks for food, they feed her. They don't just purposely starve her to get her to slim down. She slims down because she has nowhere to lay. And because she has nowhere to lay, they stop feeding her so much. And so she starts losing weight, and that makes her able to fly, where a queen that's laying, if she does try to fly, if any of you have ever had a queen fly off, you'll notice she doesn't get more than about 3 or 4 feet usually, and she lands on the grass because she's just too fat. She's too big. Her ovarioles are all swollen up, and she's laying more than her weight in eggs a day. They're feeding her constantly with royal jelly. Well, now that she has nowhere to lay, she's not asking for all that food. Her ovarioles start slowing down because she's not eating as much, and because she has nowhere to lay. And so she starts losing weight, and now she can actually fly. And if they swarm, she needs to be able to fly with the swarm. So the other thing is, it's freed up the what would have been nurse bees, so that they don't really need them, and they can leave the swarm. So about this point, they decide to build queen cells. Usually sometime right around or shortly after, when they get capped, the hive swarms. So here's your problem as a beekeeper: is you open up the hive and you find a bunch of capped queen cells. Odds are they swarmed yesterday. So it's a bad idea to destroy all these queen cells. You'll probably end up queenless. Now, I find queen cells are really well-fed queens, so I don't want to waste them, but I probably also don't want to leave all of them here, because that would kind of waste them, because then somewhere down the line here, they're just going to tear them all down. But we'll go further into that. So basically, this depends on the weather. So it's usually, when they swarm, it's a nice sunny day. Bees don't like to get stuck out in the weather. They don't like getting stuck in the rain. I've seen swarms in a tree in a rainstorm, and they do better than you might think they do, because they basically put themselves together like shingles on a roof, and the water runs down their wings and runs off, and it doesn't even get into the inside of the cluster. It's still a little hard on the bees on the outside of the cluster, but they do better than you might think. But they don't really like getting stuck out in the weather, so they usually wait for a nice sunny day to leave, and then they'll try to cluster on a branch, usually fairly close. Odds are not more than 100, 200 yards from the hive, they're going to find a branch to land on. Some of that just depends on what's available. And then they'll cluster there until they make up their mind where they're going to go. Now, sometimes it's obvious they already knew where they're going to go, because I've seen them just barely get settled on the branch and then take off for the wild blue yonder. In which case, I'm pretty sure they already knew where they were going. They were just getting organized on the branch before they took off for it. Other times, though, they'll get stuck on this branch because they don't know where they're going to go yet, and the scout bees start going out and trying to find a new home, and the scout bees keep coming back and doing a dance for the place they think is the best place, and they all keep this up until they have a consensus, until all the scout bees have checked out at least the locations that some of the scout bees are the most excited about, and they'll go check those out, and then they'll just keep doing this until they come to some kind of consensus. Or they don't come to a consensus and they get stuck there and they start building comb and the queen starts laying in it, and then you have one of these outdoor hives that in Nebraska would never make it through the winter. But that can happen. But usually within 2 or 3 days, they find a new location, and actually usually they take off for the new locations. They usually swarm about 10 in the morning, and they usually leave by about 2 in the afternoon. That's just on the average. But of course, there's the ones that just barely land, take off, and then there's the ones that are stuck there until they build a colony there and can't leave. And then there's the ones in between. But the amount of time they're there usually is not more than a couple of days. So anyway, they find a new location, they take off. Now let's go back to the hive. So back in the old hive where all these bees left, if they still think they're crowded, then one of the virgin queens leaves with more bees in an after swarm. And if they still think they're too crowded, they might keep doing that. Now, sometimes you get bees that are swarmy and they'll just swarm themselves to death. They'll just keep leaving with the next queen and the next queen and the next queen until there's almost no bees left. That's sad, but it does happen. I'm just going to mention this in case you're interested in looking into it. I don't really do this, but the people who are doing this seem to find it pretty successful. Walt Wright wrote some papers on what he calls nectar management. He was calling it checkerboarding, but everybody seemed to be misunderstanding what that meant. But if you'd like to read his writings, they're on BeeSource. If you go to BeeSource, and then there's one of the tabs at the top that'll get you to other people's points of view and articles. I'm not sure what they're calling it now. They keep changing their menu around, but you should be able to find Walt Wright's writings there, most of his articles that he had published. And it's basically a process that happens well before swarm season, and you put alternating frames of empty drawn comb and capped honey above the brood nest. And then it gives the bees the sense that they're not strong enough to swarm, and they tend to expand up into that area very quickly. And so the queen doesn't run out of room to lay. And anyway, that's that system. I'm not going to talk more about that other than mentioning it. So let's assume you're looking at a hive and you're starting to see this sequence in process. So in other words, the brood nest is starting to get backfilled. That's really the point at which you want to catch it. If you wait until you got queen cells, it's probably not going to work. But if you can catch it when the brood nest is starting to get crowded, as you're inspecting in the spring, here's some of your clues you want to be looking for, because you're trying to anticipate this, right? So one of the clues you're looking for is that they'll start raising a lot of drones. When they start raising a lot of drones, you're moving into prime swarm season, and that's when you need to start keeping an eye on it. And that doesn't happen at the same time every year. I've had my hive swarming the first week of May, and I've had them not swarm until the first week of June. So it can vary a lot, but a pretty good clue is when they're starting to raise a lot of drones. If they're starting to raise a lot of drones, you ought to start keeping an eye on the brood nest. And if the brood nest starts getting backfilled, then it's probably time to take some steps. So one of the things you can do is open up the brood nest. Some of this gets complicated by what you use for equipment. I run all 8-frame medium boxes, and so every frame is interchangeable and can go anywhere else in the hive. And that's really convenient when you're trying to open the brood nest, because I have to take some frames of brood out of the brood nest, preferably frames of honey, but also sometimes frames of brood, and move them somewhere else to open up the brood nest, and then put some empty frames in the brood nest. Um, the other thing is you kind of are doing this when you're pulling out frames out of the brood nest. But if you pull honey frames out and move them up and then put in empty frames, then it's a little different effect than pyramiding up, which is where you actually take frames of brood out and move them up to the next box to expand the brood nest into the next box on purpose. This can also be pretty effective because now it's kind of expanding the brood nest. Not only expanding it by making room in it by putting empty frames in, but by putting brood in the next box. So here's what happens, especially if you give them empty frames. And by that, I mean empty. I mean, no, you can have foundation on it, I guess, if you really want foundation. I don't use foundation, but preferably an empty frame, because an empty frame immediately employs all those unemployed nurse bees, because now they start drawing comb because there's this gap in the brood nest. They all start clustering there and they start drawing comb in the middle of the brood nest. Now, why not give them drawn comb? Well, because if you give them drawn comb, they'll immediately backfill it with honey, with nectar. So if you give them an empty comb, what happens is they start drawing comb, and as soon as there's just a midrib there, the queen will lay an egg, and it's not deep enough to put any honey in yet, any nectar in yet, and so they're not putting nectar in it, and the queen lays in it, and now they start raising the brood. Where if I give them drawn comb, they'll just immediately start putting nectar in every single cell to try and keep the queen from laying. So it's much more effective to give them an empty frame than it is to give them a drawn comb when you've got them backfilling the brood nest. If they're not trying to backfill the brood nest yet, and I just want to give them a place for the queen to lay, well, then drawn comb is great because the queen can lay in it, and if they're not trying to backfill it, it works out well. If they're trying to backfill it, though, it does not work out well. So anyway, now what happens is, because they're drawing this comb, now the queen has somewhere to lay, so now the queen's laying again, and the nurse bees are employed again, and so I've kind of turned the sequence around, at least temporarily. Now they're likely to be very determined to swarm, and they'll probably try and turn this back around again, but it'll take them 2 or 3 weeks from the time I do this, and if it's too close to the if it's only 2 or 3 weeks from the main flow, once the main flow starts, they tend to give up on trying to swarm, and they just start gathering nectar because they've shifted gears into, let's put honey away for the winter. But if it's like 6 weeks before the main flow when I'm doing this, I may have to do it again before the main flow gets here, or they may manage to turn it around and start trying to swarm again. So you could do this even before they start trying to backfill it, but here's what you got to be able to do. You got to be able to take a frame, make a space in the brood nest by pulling a frame of honey out, probably, and you make that space and watch and see what happens. And if the bees immediately start festooning in that gap, and that gap quickly fills with bees, then you could probably put an empty frame in there. If you make another gap and it doesn't fill with empty bees, you probably shouldn't put another empty frame in their brood nest. Now you can also put them on the edge of the brood nest. That has the advantage that you're not going to chill the brood by making a gap in the middle of the brood nest, but that gap in the middle of the brood nest really works about the best as long as it doesn't get them spread too thin where they can't keep it filled with bees. Now, keep in mind that there's the temptation here to split them to try and avoid all this, and you can if you really want to make increase. But the problem is, if you split them, you're not going to get as much honey, and you are going to weaken the hive. And if you split them too weak, then they have trouble managing. Dr. Harbaugh did a study on how crowded bees are, and how crowded bees are healthier and produce more honey and produce more bees, and that's a fact. Now, let's think about that a minute. Part of that is not just the number of bees, but the density of bees. A high density of bees tends to be a healthy colony, and a low density of bees does not tend to thrive very much. So that's part of the problem with doing an early split that isn't very strong, is they aren't going to thrive as much as a good strong colony is. Part of this also is size, though, to a certain extent, because there's a number of bees that we often call critical mass, where all of a sudden the bees are really efficient. If you think of a bee colony as an economy, let's think of it as a household economy. Basically, you got a certain amount of bills to pay, you've got a certain amount of overhead to run the colony, and until you have enough bees to get everything done that needs to get done, then they tend to struggle. Once they get to the point where they can get it all done, well, then they start to thrive. And it's a lot like if you're not rich enough to pay all your bills, life's a struggle. You get to the point where you can pay all your bills and you got a little left over, life starts looking pretty good. So you kind of want to keep them with a high density of bees. That gets back to deciding how many frames I'm going to stick in the brood nest. If I spread them too thin, then I'm not going to help them stay healthy. But I could do this fairly early as long as it's not still really cold at night, and they can easily fill the gap with festooning bees. Now, once they're building swarm cells, in my experience, they're hopelessly committed to swarming. Now, somebody once said, if you're trying to if you're trying to do birth control, you need to catch it before conception. This is kind of the point of conception. When they start building swarm cells, they're pretty much committed. You can destroy them all, but then you're more likely to end up with a queenless colony. Plus, my experience, they often go ahead and swarm. Sometimes they'll swarm without even a queen, not very often, but it's just a bad idea. I think once they're trying to swarm, it's best to just split them. Now, I told you to do strong splits. That's especially true if you're trying to make increase, but if you're just trying to take advantage of all these nice fat queen cells, a frame of brood with a queen cell and a frame of honey and an extra shake of bees will set up a 2-frame nuke and get these queens mated, and then you can use them to requeen hives that aren't doing so well, or whatever else you'd like to do. But a swarm cell tends to be a well-fed cell. What you want to get a good queen is you want well-fed and well-bred queens. Genetics is nice, but if they're not well-fed and they're not well-bred, it doesn't matter how good their genetics is. So swarm cells tend to be well-fed partly because it's the right time of year, and they tend to be well-bred for the same reason, because they just raised a whole bunch of drones purposely because it's that time of year. And so the other colonies out there that you're hoping those queens will mate with are also raising a lot of drones because it's the right time of year. So it's a great way to get good queens that are well-fed and well-bred. And I often I call it splitting them to the 4 winds, where I take every frame that has a queen cell and put it with a frame of honey and an extra shake of bees and let them finish that queen. Usually these are already capped, most of them. If they're not already capped, I might not do the split because I want them well fed. Once I put them in a little 2-frame colony, they're not going to get well fed anymore because there's not enough bees anymore. There's people who say that if you split on swarm cells, you're going to get swarmy bees. I think there is such a thing as swarmy bees. To me, swarmy bees are the ones that first of all, they swarm at a bad time. They swarm under circumstances where they really shouldn't be swarming. So as an example, I had some that I think were half Africanized that I bought from Texas one year. And they swarmed in the middle of August in the middle of a drought. I had 4 of them, all swarmed right in the middle of a drought in August. Now, the good news is, at least from my point of view, because I don't want Africanized genetics around, if you swarm in the middle of August in Nebraska, it doesn't matter how far you fly, it's not gonna get you out of the drought. That might be a good survival technique if you live in some place where 6 miles up the road it's not a drought, but it doesn't work in Nebraska because the whole state's in a drought, and no matter how far they fly, they're going to starve. So that's not a good time. Now, those are swarmy bees. They swarmed at a time that's bad for the bees, and it doesn't make sense that they would swarm then. Also, swarmy bees are the ones that swarm and after swarm and after swarm and after swarm until there's no bees left. That's swarmy bees. I do not want to breed from those kinds of bees. But just because they want to swarm doesn't make them swarmy bees. If the conditions are right, the every hive is going to try and swarm if the conditions are right. If they didn't try to swarm, it would be the end of the species, which is basically what P.C. Chadwick said here in 1936 in a letter to the American Bee Journal. He says, if we actually managed to breed bees that wouldn't swarm, it would be tantamount to breeding the mating instinct out of domestic animals. It actually wouldn't only be tantamount, it would be breeding the mating instinct out of a domestic animal. It would be bad for the species, and it would, in fact, let's talk about this for just a second. We bred bees for a couple of centuries to not be swarmy. We also bred them to make less drones. And what was the result of that? Well, the result was that when the Africanized honeybees moved in, they outbred our bees by a long shot because they swarmed at the drop of a hat, and they made lots of drones. And so we bred our bees to be reproductively disadvantaged. And I don't think it's to our advantage to breed the genetics that we want to be reproductively disadvantaged. But that's what we did. So this I said before, basically you take every frame that's got a queen cell and give it a frame of honey and some extra bees and let them finish that queen. Now, if I find the queen, I like to put the old queen in a nuke with a frame of brood and a frame of honey, because that way it simulates a swarm in the sense that the old queen's gone. And a lot of the bees are gone because I split them a bunch of different ways, and so they're unlikely to swarm. I would never say that this is going to guarantee they won't swarm, because I don't think you can ever guarantee they won't swarm. It's just, it's just too much of an instinct in their genetics to want to reproduce. But this works most of the time, by far more than 90% of the time, but it doesn't always work. So let's talk about the actual swarm now. Let's assume I failed at all this and now they've swarmed. So what does the swarm do? The bees come out in this tornado of bees. If you could see inside the hive, you would see that it just turns into total chaos. All the bees inside the hive get agitated and excited and just start running everywhere. And then they all start running out the door. And then they start swirling in the air in a circle that looks like a tornado. And then they start heading off in some direction to a limb, and they start settling on the limb. And then we said before, the scouts start looking for new location and they answer for them. And then, eventually they fly off to the new location. So a swarm is organized around two primary smells: the queen pheromones, because they're looking for the queen, and the Nasanov pheromones, because they're looking for the group of bees. And the bees give off Nasanov. They fan it, and they open their gland on their behind, and they fan the Nasanov. So if you're trying to catch a swarm, these are the smells you need to use. I'd also use these if I'm doing a cutout to put in the box where I want them to move into. I would also use these if I'm trying to lure a swarm out of a tree. I'd also use these if I was setting up a bait hive. These are the two smells around which bees are organized. Even if it's not a swarm, it's really what they're organized around. It's just that when they're in a swarm, it's the only two things they're organized around, where when they're in the colony, there's also the smell of the brood, there's the smell of the old comb, there's all the other things in the colony that are also attractive, but these are the two main things that bees organize around. So if you're setting up bait hives, the other things that are attractive in a bait hive are old brood comb. Old brood comb not only smells like old brood and probably has some brood pheromones left residually in the wax, but it's got all kinds of queen pheromones, because the queen has tarsal pheromones on her feet that everywhere she walks, they can smell that. So another thing that's useful is an old box. I don't know why bees prefer an old box. I don't just mean an old box that the bees were in, although that's helpful too. But I mean, bees seem to like old rotten wood better than they like brand new wood. So if you've got an old box that isn't new, it'll probably work better as a swarm, as a bait hive than new wood. There's some research that Dr. Shepard's working on with what's his name, Stamos, and Stamos is talking about how the bees like and will collect water from certain things that have fungus in them. Well, old rotten boxes have fungus in them. Old trees, hollow trees that the bees move into, has fungus living in the wood in the tree. So it may be that it actually has a beneficial effect on the bees as well as being attractive to the bees. But one way or another, it's attractive to the bees. Now, I wouldn't put open brood in a bait hive, but I would put open brood in a maybe if I'm trying to lure them out of a tree, I might use some open brood, especially after I got them moved into the box. It's good. It's a good anchor to keep them from leaving. If you're shaking bees into a box, that's an added feature to have some open brood in there. All these things are useful just to try to put a swarm in that you're catching, but they're also useful in a bait hive where you're trying to get the bees to just find it and move in. So here's a bait hive. You can make it out of anything. Old 10 frame boxes are pretty useful. I run all medium frames, and so I actually have medium frames in here, but I want it deep enough to give them enough space that they would be willing to move in. One of the things I would keep in mind is that if you use a really small box and it's a really big swarm, they may not move in at all, or they may end up hanging on the bottom of the box. To me, the number one thing in a bait hive is to have lemongrass oil in there. That's the most attractive thing to a swarm that's looking for a home. Some queen pheromone is also helpful. You can buy queen pheromone as pseudo queen from Man Lake, but you can also, and maybe some other places, I don't know. I just know that's where I bought it before. Whatever your favorite supplier is, see if they've got it. But you can also just save all your old retired queens. When a queen starts failing and you're going to retire her, just drop her in a jar of alcohol. And pretty soon you'll have a whole jar of alcohol full of old queens and queen pheromones that are in the jar. So I'd use whatever you have available, but I would, if I were you, I'd try and accumulate all of these things and have them available so you can use them when you want to set up a bait hive. Lemongrass essential oil is one of them. There's a product out there called Swarm Commander that has basically the same stuff in it. If you look at what's in lemongrass oil, it contains all of the constituents of Nasinoff pheromone that have been found to be of any use. That scientists have said it actually has an effect on the bees because they've tried all of these individually and in combination, and what they came up with was a list. I could get you the list. It's on my website, I think, someplace. But if not, I've got it. If you want to contact me, I'll send you the list. But Swarm Commander took all the things that were in Nasinoff and mixed them to make their own, but they all naturally occur in lemongrass anyway. Queen juice is like I said, just a jar full of old queens, and then I use the alcohol that I drop them in. They're in alcohol, and I use the alcohol. Old brood comb. If you don't have any old brood comb, that's fine. But if you do, I'd use it. It's gonna help. An old used box is better than a brand new box. But if all you got is a brand new box, well, use it. It won't necessarily stop them. The most important thing is the lemongrass oil. Everything else is just stacks the deck to your advantage. You really want a size that's roughly the size of a 10 frame deep, or two 10 frame or two 8 frame mediums. That's about the right size to try and get them to move into. You can be a little smaller than that, and it'll probably still work if you use the lemongrass oil. That seems to offset almost any other disadvantage. I'd prefer not to put them directly on the ground, but I don't usually put them up any higher in a tree than I can reach with a 6-foot step ladder. Because frankly, I don't want to climb a ladder that much. Plus, I don't think it makes any difference. You can pretty much set it on something that's 2 or 3 feet off the ground, and it works just as well as 20 feet off the ground. I've done plenty of both, and I don't see much difference. This is a jar of lemongrass essential oil I bought, I don't know, 20 years ago. And I give it away to people all the time, and I've still got probably a third or a fourth of it left. I don't remember what it cost me at the time, but it wasn't that much. That's why I buy this and not Swarm Commander, because this is much cheaper and it works just fine. This is my queen juice. It's a jar with a bunch of queens. These have been in here for literally decades, and it gets darker and darker as you put more queens in. So there, I tipped it a little to get the queens to kind of pile up on the left side there, so you kind of see the queens, and it's not just because it's so dark you really can't see them in there. But when you first start this, it's just going to be clear, and you put a queen in and it'll get a little bit yellow, and you put another one in, it'll get a little more yellow. You put 10 or 15 more in, and it'll start getting brown, and you get more in there and it starts getting about black like this. But even one queen in there will work better than nothing. This is now they're calling it Temp Queen. When I bought it, well, you can see the label on there, says Pseudo Queen Bee Boost 50 pack, but the instructions over there say Temp Queen. So it kind of has two different names just on the labels that are here when I bought it. Those little tubes on the bottom are the actual Pseudo Queen. It's actually a little hollow tube that's impregnated with QMP, as opposed to the things at the top are just ties just to attach that to a bar, I guess is the idea. I usually cut these into quarters and just use a quarter of it in a bait hive. I'm just trying to get them interested in it, and that seems to be sufficient to get them interested in it. So I don't use a whole tube, I just use a quarter of one. So a bait hive, like I said, you can put it in a tree, you can put it whatever. I usually bait it when prime swarm season is coming up pretty quickly. Like here, that's usually like the 1st of May. I'll bait it, and then the prime swarm season starts about the 2nd week of May usually, and ends about the 2nd week of June here. When I do luring a swarm out of a tree, I do basically the same thing. I set up just like the bait hive, except it's probably a standard hive instead of that tall skinny one I made was mostly so I could tie it to a tree, and it's got a little more vertical than horizontal, so it's easy to put in the crotch of a tree or tie to a tree or something. But for this, I'd probably just use 2 8-frame medium boxes because that's my standard, or one depending on the size of the swarm. If it's a huge cluster up there, I might even use 3 8-frame boxes because I think it'll take that for them to fit, but probably just one. And if it's a pretty good size swarm, probably 2. But I set it up on the ground right under the swarm, and I put queen mandibular pheromone in it. I put Nasonoff in it. I usually put a little more lemongrass oil. I put a little more lemongrass oil right around the entrance than I put inside, because the problem is if I put too much inside, it'll drive them out. And if I put a little more right around the entrance on the outside, they're more likely to smell it and get interested and come down and start paying attention to it. So I set that up on the ground, and if the swarm hasn't made up their mind, they almost always move in, which is 90% of the time. Odds are they'll either move in or they will leave shortly after I put it there because they'd already made up their mind where they were going to go. But they rapidly get interested in it, and it's almost always the best spot they can find because it's the right size. It smells like Nasonoff. It smells like queen. And so those are the things that the swarm tends to organize around anyway, and so they're very likely to move in. I started doing this because one time I was 20 feet up a ladder with no protective equipment because I was in a hurry, and you know how it is. You're afraid the swarm is going to fly off any second now, and swarms are not usually very aggressive, and that's true. And I climbed up the ladder and went to shake them into the box, and the problem is swarms are not just an inanimate thing. When you shake it, they don't just automatically let go and fall straight down. Sometimes they hang on and it swings like a pendulum, which it did. It swung like a pendulum and went down the back of my shirt. And now I'm 20 foot up a ladder thinking if I fall off this ladder, I'm going to have $1,000 hospital bill, probably minimum, if I live through it. And that's the last time I climbed a ladder to do that. I decided that, you know what, it's just a swarm. I could buy a package for whatever. It'd be nice to get the swarm, but it's not that big a deal. So I started baiting them down instead. I put basically a bait hive down at the bottom of the tree, and usually I get them to move in. And if I don't get them to move in, it's not that big a loss, but usually they do. This is an interesting concept. It's called a Russian Scion, and the idea is to have that place for the swarm to bivouac, that place that the swarm's going to land before they go find a place. Now you want to make it attractive, and you want to give them some things that make it attractive. So I try to put a piece of burlap that's got beeswax on it, so it smells like home. Some lemongrass oil, so it smells like the cluster. The other thing about the burlap is it gives the bees something to hold on to, so it gives them something to grab onto to hang as a cluster. It also helps if they're not in the sun. You'll notice when they bivouac, usually they pick a place where they're going to get some shade from the tree, and some protection from the rain from the tree. So I put a little roof on it, and then it doesn't really have to be way up in the sky. I've seen many a swarm land on a little 3 foot tall, 4 foot tall fruit tree. For some reason, they seem to like fruit trees a little more than some other trees. It seems like they'll land on a little fruit tree more than they'll land on a big, tall pine tree. But I've had them land on a big, tall pine tree, and I've had them land way, way up in a cedar tree. They might land anywhere, but 8 foot up or so is helpful. This is mine. We built this at bee camp one year. I did the tripod because I tried doing it on one stick like the Russians do, but the wind in Nebraska is just too constant and too heavy. So if you look close, you can see that down at the feet of that tripod, there's some ropes there. So basically I have it roped so that it won't open up too wide, and then I staked the ropes down so that it won't blow over. But that piece you see hanging down in the middle there is burlap soaked in beeswax, and there's two 1x12s up there to make kind of a roof and a shade for them. So this is right after we built it first with one stick, like I said, and that didn't work well. This is right after we redid it with the tripod. I think those sides are actually like 15 foot or so. So actually standing up there, the middle is probably 12 feet off the ground, I would guess. Here it is when it had a swarm in it. I have a video on this on my YouTube channel. If you go to my website and click on the YouTube channel, and you can go find this, and there's a video on the whole thing. Here's the swarm that's up in this is just a little swarm, but it's up in the Scion. And so I took a frame and stuck it up in the swarm, and then they start crawling on the frame. This was just to kind of get some of them already moved in. And hopefully, if I'm really lucky, the queen will get on there, and then I'll have the queen in there. But if I can at least get some of them to get on here, it's less that I have to shake in. I've done this a lot of different ways in my life. This is going to be the one that works the best. I've just tried to shake them into a box. The problem is half the time they just fly back to the limb. In fact, I'd say more than half the time. Probably a lot higher than half the time. So this is my preferred method at this point in time, is you put a sheet down and you shake them down on the sheet, and then you put your bait hive on the sheet before you shake them down, even, so that you don't have to set it on top of bees. And then you drum. I've got a hive tool in my hand there, and I'm drumming on the hive. Now, drumming on the hive, you're just doing a tap, 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 tap. It's not like you're trying to beat it really hard. You're just tap, 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 tap. And the bees will immediately start paying attention to that. And a few of them will walk over, and then they'll start fanning. And then a few more will walk over and start fanning. And then they just all start marching in. Now, this works even better if you bait this box with some lemongrass oil and some queen mandibular pheromone. But this works even if you don't. But it works better if you do. But you can see this isn't a brand new box. It's a rather old box. And the sheet is essential. I know it doesn't seem like it should be, but if you shake these bees into the grass, it's like a forest that they have to get through. You shake them on the sheet, it's like a highway. They just walk right across it, and they will. once you start tapping it, and then once they start fanning, the next thing you know, the queen will march right in there. Now, if you see the queen and she's marching across there, it's a good idea to catch her in a queen clip and then put her in the hive, and that way you know she can't leave. And then if you leave them in there like at least overnight, and then maybe the next day give them a frame of open brood and then let the queen loose, they'll almost always stay. So here's where they got shut down on a tarp instead of a sheet, but it's the same principle. They're not down on the grass. And this is a queen clip. If you catch the queen it's a hair clip queen catcher. I have trouble finding these plastic ones anymore. I don't know why. This should be hard to find. But this one, the ears don't stick out so far, so it fits in my pocket nicely. And it's the metal ones. I cut a queen in half once with the metal ones, so I got kind of turned off on those. You still ought to be gentle whenever you use the queen clip. Set it down on the queen and let it close very gently. And if it feels like it's not going, and keep an eye where you think the queen is and try and make sure you don't squish her. But you can catch a queen pretty well with these. And then once she's caught, the slots are big enough for workers to get in and out, but the queen can't get in and out. So when you're catching a swarm, this is very nice to catch the queen. If you see her, if you don't see her, I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep over her, but if you see her, you can catch her and put her in the hive, and then she can't leave. And then you can let them get settled in, and then give them a frame open brood and then let her out, and then they'll likely stay. Now, the other thing you can do to try and keep them from leaving is you can put a queen excluder between the entrance and the bees so they can't get out. They have to go through the queen excluder to get out. They can get in and out, but the queen can't get in and out. And if you leave that on for a few days, then the queen will start laying, and then you can probably take that out. Now, the problem is, I say the queen will start laying. That's if it's the primary swarm. If it's a secondary swarm, it's a virgin queen. And if she can't get out to mate, then she'll never lay. So don't wait for her to lay. If she's not laying in 2 or 3 days, then pull the queen excluder off anyway so she can go get mated. But, I don't hear people talk about drumming much anymore, but people used to drum all the time. If you take any old hive and start drumming on it, the bees will tend to run up. It's just what they do. And if they're outside the hive, they tend to run in. And you can argue all you want that bees can't hear, but they quickly respond to you drumming on the hive. Even if they're not in the hive and they're on the sheet and you're drumming on the hive, they quickly start to respond to it. And once you get the bees to decide to move in on their own, they almost always stay. If I shake them in the hive, they almost always leave. They sometimes stay, but they just quite often leave. So, in my experience, yeah, get them to move in on their own. That's the best. Now, if you can give them a frame of open brood, that's always good to anchor them. Now, again, if you're a new beekeeper and you're just trying to get some bees and you don't have any open brood, you can do this without it. It's just that much more insurance that they won't leave. Or you could just catch the queen on your hand. This was in the Daily Mail. This guy was trying to catch a swarm. He didn't have any equipment, so he just caught the queen in his hand and waited till they all crawled on his arm and then went home and shook them in a hive. I'm not sure I recommend this, but it could work. So if you want more information on split swarm prevention, top bars, crush and strain, any of these topics, this is my website. I have quite a few classic queen rearing books on that website, including Doolittle's Scientific Queen Rearing, and I've got the Miller Method by Miller, and the Alley Method by Alley, and the Hopkins Method by Hopkins, and I have the first volume of Huber's New Observations on the Natural History of Bees from the early, it was like 1809 translation into English. It's not as good as the one I published, which is the Dadant translation. And the one I published also has volume 2, and it also has letters of Huber that Huber wrote to various people that was published later on. I also have Huber in publication. I have Huber's New Observations, both volumes, in English, French, Spanish, German. Yeah, I guess that's it. If you're interested, this is my contact information. I encode that email address because when I didn't encode it, I would get lots of emails from these Russian women who all want to marry me, I guess. But I have a perfectly good wife at home. I'm not really interested. So by encoding it, the spam bots don't find it and start emailing me. That's my YouTube channel. If you want to be a patron, I've got locals account. My books, lately I published Beekeeping Naturally, a Simple Recipe, which is basically just saying, if I were starting beekeeping today, this is what I'd do, without all the details of everything about beekeeping. The Practical Queen Breeder is what I'm doing right now in my queen breeding. This is the way I'm doing it, and I published a book on it. The Practical Beekeeper is the big thick book that you can buy in individual volumes if you'd prefer, which covers about everything.